purpose of a timeout is to fail a test if execution goes beyond a certain time. For example, we may have a requirement to complete a download in 3 seconds, but if the download completes in 5 seconds, then the test fails because execution did not complete the requirement of 3 seconds. By the end of this session, you will learn how to apply a timeout to the test method, apply a timeout to the test class, apply a timeout to a separate thread, and apply a timeout by using an assertion. Let's start by applying a timeout to the test method. In the IDE, we're going to create a class by going to the JUnit 5 test package. Right-click, new Java class. The name is Timeout Test. In the class, I will start with WebDriver, then import WebDriver. I'm going to also make some room, then write the configuration annotations. Now, to set up a test, I'm going to write the annotation of before each. This will set up each test. The name will be set up test. And I'm going to write driver equals new Firefox driver. Normally, I use Chrome driver, but this time let's use a different browser. Also, maximize the browser by writing driver.manage.window.maximize. At this point, we can load the AUT with driver.get. Go to the application under test, then copy the URL. The test script will click Start Download, then wait for the download to complete. After the download completes, the test will inspect the complete message and assert the complete message. Okay, so now back to the IDE. I'm going to paste the URL, and it's pretty long. LambdaTest.com, Selenium Playground, jQuery, download progress bar demo. You know what? I also will use an implicit wait. I prefer not to use implicit wait in my projects on my job, but for the demo, I'm going to use driver.manage timeouts, implicit wait, duration of seconds. The seconds will be 30. After each test, I'm going to write the method to close the browser and quit the driver. Public void tear down test. Driver.quit is the statement we're going to use. Now, for our first test, let's write public void. How about test download progress? That'd be cool. And for this test script, there will be 3 steps. The first step, step 1, will click the start download button. Step 2, we'll get the complete message. And step 3, we'll assert the complete message. And those are the 3 steps. Let's go to the browser. and inspect these elements, beginning with start download. Going to make this a little bigger, and start download has an ID value of download button. Okay, so we see it has a div tag and as the parent and button as the tag name and ID. Okay, so we're going to use the ID value to find this element with Selenium. Next, let's go ahead and inspect the message that completes. When it shows complete, I'm going to inspect, and it has a div tag also, but it has a class attribute as the only attribute. The parent has a div tag, and it has ID as an attribute, and it has a value of dialog. Okay, so let's test and find this element before we use it. To find it, I'm going to write 2 forward slashes, div, square brackets, at ID equals, the single quotes, then I'm going to write dialog. And we see it shows 1 of 1. Now we found the parent. Let's find the element we need by writing div, opening closing brackets, text equals complete exclamation point. Yes, we found the element. So at this point, I'm going to copy the value. Then go back to the IDE. So for the first step, we find the element by writing driver.findElement by ID. The value was download button. We found the element, now perform an action of click. Step 1 is complete. Next is step 2. We're going to find the element after we write the information to store the variable in complete message. Driver.findElement. I'm going to put this on the next line. And we're going to find it by writing by XPath, then paste in the value. The method to get the text from the application under test is getText. And it's going to store the information in complete message. Now, it's optional, but for this next part, I'm going to write the part to expect the value that we want, the actual result, and it's optional to write a message. But I'm going to still write the message starting with assertions dot assert equals what we expect the message to be, complete with an exclamation point. What's the actual result we expect? Well, we expect complete message, which is returned from the application. At this point, we could stop, but let's go ahead and add a message. The message will be, how about expected and actual messages do not match. How about a print statement? The print statement will simply write test pass. Okay, now let's remove the comments because we really don't need the comments for the steps. And let's run. The console should show test passed. Let me run again because we see well, that's okay. I'm going to run again because the application under test was covered up by the drop-down information because I was accidentally hovering over it. So let's run again. Bingo. The run window shows the test pass with the green check mark, and the console shows test pass. At this point, let's test the requirements. We want the test to be completed in 1 second. Therefore, we write at timeout, which is the annotation from JUnit 5. Within the parentheses, we write 1. And that's all we need to apply a timeout annotation for JUnit 5. Let's run again. This time, the test should fail. And we should not see test pass in the console as the print statement. Bingo. As expected, the test is red because it failed. And it failed with an exception. Timeout exception. Scroll over and it shows the method name and it timed out after 1 second. Notice with the timeout annotation, it does not contain a time unit such as milliseconds, microseconds, minutes, seconds. It does not have that. That's because by default, timeout has a time unit of seconds. However, JUnit 5 allows us to add a value and a time unit. Let me start by adding 1 to the method name. And I'm going to copy this test script, then paste a second test script. Rename this one to 2. Okay, so inside the timeout annotation, I'm going to write value equals 2000, comma, unit equals time unit. And we see different measurements in the IntelliSense. We see days, hours, microseconds, milliseconds, minutes, nanoseconds, and seconds. Now, we're going to use milliseconds. 2000 milliseconds is equal to 2 seconds. Also, it does not matter if we add the timeout annotation before the test annotation or after the test annotation. And since the previous test was before the test annotation, I'm going to keep this at after the test annotation and also run this test. Now, this time, the console should also show a timeout exception, but it will not show seconds as the time unit. Bingo, we see that it failed. We see timeout exception, and it shows timed out after 2000 milliseconds. So it works as we expect it to. Both test scripts show how a timeout is applied to the test method. Now, let's apply a timeout to the class. Start in the IDE by commenting out the timeout annotations. That's the first annotation, the second annotation. The reason why I comment out the timeout annotation at the method level, because it will override the timeouts at the class level. For the class level, we write timeout before public class. Then we write the value. How about we write 5 seconds as the value? Now, with the timeout at the method level, we can include the timeout annotation before test and after test, but not at the class level. At the class level, it must always be above the public class declaration. We can also include the different time unit measurements like milliseconds or microseconds. This time, let's run at the class level, and it will execute both test scripts. That's one failure. And that's two failures. For the first failure, we see the timeout exception as expected, and it shows a timeout after 5 seconds. That's the first test. Scroll down to the second test, and it also showed the timeout exception with 5 seconds as the timeout value. That's because it was applied at the class level. So both test scripts have 5 seconds as the timeout measurement for seconds. Let me show you how the method timeout overrides the class timeout by removing the comments for test 1 and test 2. Also, since the seconds is the default timeout value, we can write value equals 5. If we want to add a different timeout, we can do that by writing, timeout.unit, and we can include milliseconds if we want to. What we cannot use is seconds, because seconds is the default. Notice how it shows a gray writing. That's because it is redundant value, because they know that it's seconds. So we do not have to write seconds. If I hover timeUnit.seconds, IntelliSense shows remove redundant parameter. It's redundant because seconds is the default. So let's run again at the class level, and we will see how the method timeout override the class timeout. That's one failure for test 1. That's the second failure for test 2. Now let's see what the timeout seconds shows, or milliseconds. For test 1, it timed out after 1 second. For test 2, it timed out after 2,000, milliseconds. Bingo. That's it for applying a timeout to the class. Next is applying a timeout to the thread. A scenario for applying a timeout to the thread is when we have many test scripts, but some of the test scripts are slow than others. It takes longer to execute. The slow test scripts can execute in a different thread. That way it will not interrupt or slow down the other test scripts that execute much faster. So let me start by copying the second test script. Then I will apply the third test script in a different thread. So I'm going to rename this here test timeout. How about thread mode? Okay, so for the value, write 1. And for the time unit, I'm going to include minutes as the time unit. So it should finish in 1 minute. After minutes, I'm going to include the thread mode by writing thread mode equals timeout thread mode. Bingo. And the thread mode has 3 ways: separate thread, same thread, and inferior. Not a class. It's not a thread mode, because here we see thread mode, and there are 3 for each one of them. Separate thread mode is what we're going to use. And since this is outside of the screen, I'm going to apply these on a different line. I could keep the first 2 on the same line. Now I'm going to just separate like this here, where each parameter has its own line. Okay, so to confirm the test runs in its own separate thread, let's add some print statements. The print statement is going to be thread.currentThread.getID. The second one will get the name, and that's it. Let me also add the same 2 print statements to the previous 2 test scripts, and we will see how the thread mode has its own thread, separate thread. At this point, I'm going to run the entire class, which include all 3 test scripts. This time, the run window should show 1 pass and 2 failed. The one that passed is the thread mode, bingo. Because it did not take longer than 1 minute to complete the test, the download progress. That's why it passed. So the next thing we want to investigate is the different threads, the ID and the name. Bingo. As expected, 1 pass, 2 failed. And for the one that passed, we see an ID value of 29 for the thread, and the name is JUnit Timeout Thread 1. We also see test pass, which is that print statement at the bottom. For timeout, for the first one, we show ID of 1 with the name as main. That's the first one. For the second one, we also see ID value of 1 with main as the name. So test script 1, test script 2 have the same ID and name, but test 3 shows a different ID and name. That verifies that it ran in a different thread. That's it for applying a timeout to the thread. Next, let's apply timeout using an assertion. In the IDE, I'm going to start by creating a different test. So let me close this down. I'm going to just minimize these and start with a new test with the name of public void. How about test timeout assertion? Let me bring this up some. Now, for timeout assertions, we write assertions and we put assert timeout. And do you see those 6 overloaded methods? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We are going to use the one that has duration for timeout, executable, which is a method that we need to call, and a string message. I like adding messages, even though they are optional. For the parameter of timeout, let's write duration of milliseconds. And it'll be 3 milliseconds, which is 3 seconds. Next, we need a method to execute. So let's create a method that wraps a sleep statement. And I'm going to make this private void hard wait. Pass in a value of milliseconds. and put for hard sleep statements, most people write thread.sleep for the sleep statement. And I'm going to pass in milliseconds. Also, add the exception. Now, most people write thread.sleep. Another way we can write a sleep statement is TimeUnit. TimeUnit, I'm going to use milliseconds. Dot sleep and pass in milliseconds. So since I have TimeUnit dot milliseconds dot sleep, I'm going to come in thread.sleep. At this point, we're going to call the hard wait statement because the assert timeout method needs an executable method. We call it using a lambda expression, starting with open and close the parentheses, hyphen, the arrow, and let's call the method by writing hard wait. Now I will pass in a value of 4,000. Add a comma. The message will be, how about test failed due to timeout. We expect the test to complete in 3,000 seconds, but it will complete in, complete in 3,000 milliseconds, which is 3 seconds, but it will complete in 4,000 milliseconds, which is equal to 4 seconds. Therefore, the test will fail and show the assertion message. Let's run. As expected, the test failed with a yellow icon. We see assertion failed error, the message test failed due to timeout. Why did it fail? It failed because execution exceeded timeout of 3,000 milliseconds by 1,014 milliseconds. So it exceeded 3 seconds by 1,014 milliseconds, which is 1 second. That's it for applying a timeout using an assertion, and those are the ways we can apply a timeout using JUnit 5 assertion. Next, we will look at WebDriver wait. If you would like to learn more, then make sure to follow the blogs at www.lambdatest.com/blog and community.lambdatest.com. In addition to the blogs, you can earn a certification at www.lambdatest.com/certifications. Get educated, get recognized.